Hey everyone, hope you all had a great Christmas. As we wind down 2024, I just want to extend my heartfelt thanks to each and every one of you for supporting my channel over this year. I've gained over 3,600 subscribers this year alone, and I didn't even have to, believe it or not. Obviously, it's much easier for me just to go ahead and repair these bikes and sell them or flip them or do work for my customers without having to record all this stuff. But the reason why I do it is because of all of your positive feedback. I love getting the comment that I helped you out with an issue or you were able to do your first rebuild because of my videos. Although the primary objective of this channel is not to be educational, it's supposed to be just for entertainment purposes only. I'm a human, I make mistakes, and I certainly don't want anybody to make a mistake because of something I told you to do. I'm just a regular guy who used to do this kind of work as a side job. I was an auto mechanic for many years, and I love doing this on the side, and I decided to take this on full time. So I'm certainly not perfect, and I have no problem with anybody calling me out on anything, that's for sure, because that's the way I learn as well. I try to do things as correct as I can to my knowledge, and hopefully that helps you guys out as well. So again, thank you guys so much. Your subscriptions mean everything. Your comments help my algorithm, help my channel grow. All of you who have purchased any of my merch, that really helps me out tremendously. And also clicking on any of my affiliate links also helps me out as well. So again, thank you guys so very much. Going into 2025, we got tons more content coming out for you. Keep those comments, subscriptions, likes, and shares coming. I really appreciate them. Today, I just basically have a montage of some of the projects that we did over this year. So hopefully you'll enjoy that. You guys have a great new year, and we'll see you in 2025. Well, my first project of the year was this 2011 KX250F. This thing had a dropped, damaged valve and piston. I went ahead and got a Pro X piston for it, kit, and new valve and spring set. That seemed to work out pretty good. Also had some broken valve guides, so we went ahead and replaced those. Recut our valve angles into the seats, and rebuilt the head. Threw a light hone on the cylinder to get ready for our new piston and rings. She started up, but it would not idle. No matter what I did, I turned the idle up as high as I could. So just blew up some of the connections and put some dielectric grease on them to see if we had a corrosion issue. Double checked my map sensor to make sure that hose wasn't damaged. Checked the fuel pressure, which was right on the money, about 43 psi. And I went ahead and did a smoke test to make sure I didn't have any leaking issues in the intake. It was a little bit of a leak from the throttle body, but it wasn't enough to be an issue. Hooked a battery up to it and started doing all my voltage tests on all of my sensors, and everything seemed to be okay. I went ahead and grabbed a used throttle body for it and swapped that out, and unfortunately that did not make a difference. I did notice on this particular throttle body that somebody had messed around with the adjustment screws, which is kind of a no-no, and that's the reason why I replaced it. Also, good thing I found a frayed throttle cable. Well, what it ended up being was, for some reason, the valves, I think on the exhaust side, had tightened up, and the clearance was too close. So we fixed that. That took care of that problem. Next one was a 2007 Honda 150R. Very common on these. The camshaft sprocket mount twisted, and the piston hit the valves. It's extremely common on these bikes for some reason. They say only on the 2007s, but I've had it on every single year. I went ahead and did like a complete frame off on this one for some reason. We had to replace the steering stem bearings on it. While we're in there, go ahead and go through the carburetor and reset our TPS sensor. As you can see, that the lobes just don't match up the way they should. I sent the head off and had it resurfaced. Went ahead and lapped in our new steel valves. Light hone on the cylinder. Get ready to put our piston and rings back together. New cam bridge, new lifters. And she ran pretty good. So I went ahead and did a whole full body kit on it. I did not put any graphics on it, but I think it looked beautiful. New front and rear tires. It's a good looking running bike too. This here particular bike was the worst bike I've ever worked on. This thing needed everything. So it had a trashed head. I tried to repair it, and it came out good. The bike actually ran pretty good, and I sold it, and unfortunately it dropped another valve on the guy, and I gave him his money back, purchased the bike back from him, and ended up parting it out. But I did the best of my ability on trying to get this one back up and running. Obviously, we recut the valves, went through the carburetor. I think this thing had some shift shaft issues as well. Can't remember if I put a new crankshaft in this. I don't know, but so we put all new valves in it, and springs, and I don't know what happened. The rear shock was completely blown out, so we had to do a rebuild on that. These are pretty similar for most of these bikes. They all kind of work the same way. Go ahead and throw a new rear tire on it, clean the rim up, get all that corrosion off of it, and new tube and tire. Wheel bearings in the rear needed to be replaced. Generally, the fronts need to be replaced on these as well. New rear brake pads. We had to redo the steering stem bearings on this one as well, which is not uncommon for the YZ250F. Most of the time they need front wheel bearings as well. So we reused the old piston, put a new set of rings on it. This bike actually ran really good. I went ahead and adorned it with a new set of plastics and a new seat cover. And that's the story with that one. This one here is the wife's bike. Purchased this one. I got a really good deal on it close to Christmas last year. The bike ran well. The clutch was a little worn. It was their daughter's bike, and it was her learning bike. So go ahead and start off with a nice fresh clutch for her. Change the oil and just go through it real quick. Make sure everything was good to go for her. And it made a huge difference. This thing grabs right off the handlebars now. So here what I'm doing is just breaking the clutch in by just slipping it and holding it in place just to get it to bite. This here is my buddy Alex's X3 2018 if I remember correctly, and he wanted to put a bump seat in, which is a seat kit that goes between the two seats over the center hump, and that's for obviously a child or something like that to ride along with you. And it has over the shoulder harnesses and everything else. And this was kind of a pain to get this set up. And I don't think it normally would be for a regular X3, but this particular one had a lot of work done to it. And there was just not a lot of space to get in here, but we were able to get it to go. I think unfortunately we ripped a little tiny bit of the seat, but it bolted in and he was able to use it just fine. It did sort of drag on the seat a little bit, and I think what we should have done was maybe space the seats up a little bit so that they didn't quite sit against the center seat as much, but it came out good and it worked great. They are still using it to this day. I want to say that he purchased this unit from Amazon. I think it was like 250 bucks. So it was time for me to start pressing my own crankshafts together. So I decided to make a jig that would hold the crankshaft webs in place when you were trying to press them back together. Even with this jig, you're not going to get this thing 100% perfect, because any little tiny bit is going to make a huge difference on the truing and balance of the crankshaft. This is just to get it pretty close. Without this, you could be way off and it'd be a lot harder. And this was a lot of work. I got small tools here, small little lathe, which actually surprised me. It did a good job. Small drill press. And some of this was some pretty heavy steel. So we drilled and tapped 3 of these steel dowels. And what they do is they can rotate in and out to accommodate smaller or larger crankshafts. And they just basically hold the upper and lower web together. Now, if I had a CNC machine or a plasma cutter, that would have been a lot easier to cut this center hole out, but you got to do what you got to do with the tools you got, right? This thing came out great and it works fantastic as well. So we're going to do our first, and I believe this was a RM125, which seems to be the theme of 2024. I did a lot of RM125 2-cycle engines. And this press plate is a press plate that I made, I think it was the previous year. As you can see, this tool is very sturdy. And this shows kind of how the crankshaft sits down in between the 3 dowels, and it holds the webs fairly close in alignment. At that point here, we just had to true the crankshaft. So this was my 1998 Suzuki RM125. And I believe it was the same situation on this one. In fact, I believe that was the crankshaft we just did, was from this 98. I did so many, it's hard to remember, but yeah, there you go. Big end bearing is shot on that thing. Pull the motor, split the cases. Typical. When you do this, you get a good chance to look inside the motor and see how well it was taken care of, and obviously it wasn't. So did a little bit of carb tech talk on this one, as far as ratios, oil mixture ratios, and why you should use what the manufacturer recommends. This particular case had a crack around the kickstart area, so I sent that out and got it welded. I do not have a AC TIG welder at this point, but that's something I'm looking forward to getting in the future. new crank main bearings and seals. And put our cases back together. We put new seals throughout the whole engine. I think we used the original piston, and I believe I re-ringed this one. They're pulling the forks because they just went ahead and put new bearings on it, but they did not do it right, and this thing was all over the place. So just went ahead and put new steering stem bearings on it. And go ahead and go through the forks, reseal those to make sure that we're not going to have any leaks with that. I believe they were showing signs of leaking. This plastic slip-on bullet tool is fantastic for doing these without damaging your seals. And they're like $5 or $6, totally worth getting one for your size forks. This is a universal fork seal driver, and it works pretty good. Here we're just setting our level, our final level, fluid level in the forks. Obviously, we're going to go ahead and change out the tire and tube. That wheel had a little bit of a wobble to it. Hey, it's a 98. One of my highest viewed videos of this, or last year, was this tire machine from Harbor Freight, which I absolutely love. I mean, is it a Rabaconda? No, but it's also like $60 when it's on sale, and it makes a world of difference instead of using a 5-gallon bucket, which I used to dread having to do. Now I don't care. So we're going to go ahead and reseal the rear caliper, change out the rear brake pads. Fires right up. And this bike actually looked pretty good too. This was a customer's bike, and he was hearing a rattling in the engine. These engines tend to be a little bit noisy, and we did do some adjustments to the manual timing chain tensioner. Listened around with a hose and a screwdriver to see if we could determine where the knock was coming from. Took this thing out on a test ride just to listen to it, and it was kind of on and off. It wasn't constant. Kind of came up with the RPM. So we went ahead and just checked our crankshaft main gear to make sure that our pin didn't drop, and put all new Loctite on the counter shaft and both of the crankshaft nuts. It's a common problem with these DRZ400s. Just to make sure that there was nothing going on nefarious in the engine, we went ahead and pulled the oil filter medium apart and checked that, and there was nothing in the screen, there was nothing in the filter. At this point here, we went ahead and did the 3x3 mod, which is so very common. Performance update for this bike, and it's some jetting, replacing some needles, cutting a hole in the airbox, getting rid of that little snorkel, doing a couple other little tuning things. drilling out the idle screw cap and doing some adjustments to the pilot screw. And he also bought an aftermarket exhaust system for this that we installed. How do you say that? Akrapovic? Akrapovic? I don't know. Anyway, took it out after this, and I'll tell you, if you have a DRZ400, do this mod. It's 100% worth it. I noticed an enormous performance upgrade. Next, we have a 1998 Seadoo Sportster, which I picked up for like 1,600 bucks. This thing needs all kinds of work, and I spent a good portion of the winter working on it. We ran some compression checks, and they were absolutely fine. Went ahead and just drained all the fuel out of it. Who knows what's in there? So the main thing was the guy was like, every time I took it out, it was going slower and slower and slower. And he said I couldn't get it to go over 15 miles an hour. And typically with Sea-Doo or any jet boat for that matter, the wear sleeve is either damaged or just worn out. And it's very common in these Sea-Doos. So pressed in a couple of new sleeves. They're super cheap, 50 bucks a piece, something like that. And the impellers were in actually really good shape. We replaced the seals and the bearings for the shaft and retorqued it. Refilled the gear oil and reinstalled everything. Next, nothing electronic worked on this thing here. So we're testing the buttons. I want to replace all these buttons. So we want to make sure everything's working properly for the lighting, the horn, the fans, the bilge pump. Of course, all the bulbs for the courtesy lighting were burned out. So we put all LEDs in there. Used an eraser wheel to take all the nasty stickers off of it. I spent a ton of time wet sanding the hull out and using compound and then polish and then wax to try to get it super shiny. And then the wife grabs a magic eraser and it's pulling off all this oxidation without all that work. So kudos to her. Saved us a lot of trouble. And just other little kind of things here and there, touching up, make things look a little better, like the hatch cover. And the warning and key beep beeper was no good, so we went ahead and put a new one of those in. I pulled out the power port and put another one in, and I also put power ports in for USB charging. And I also installed a voltmeter so I could keep track of the battery. I put a new stereo, and we used a rust stain remover to try to get some of this garbage out of the boat, and it did a pretty good job. I wasn't trying to make this thing perfect. We're actually looking to potentially get a Yamaha in the future, but yeah, we use this all year, all summer, and other than the fact that the center crankshaft seals are no good on this thing. So when it sits for a little while, first time you start it up, it smokes pretty good. And then once it warms up, the smoke goes away and she runs beautiful. I ended up going through the carburetors on this and pulling out and replacing all the 2-cycle oil. And next we're working on our 2000 RM125. And this one was recently rebuilt, but the crankshaft nut had fallen off for whatever reason. The guy tried to fix it. He shortened the stud a little bit, but couldn't get that fixed. So what I ended up having to do on this particular model was to hook my drill up so I could spin the engine over without pulling the entire engine apart, using a file to bring the outer diameter of that down so I could put a smaller nut. And I think I went with like an 8mm or 8 by 1.25. I don't remember exactly what nut I was able to get threaded on there, and that worked absolutely perfectly. Obviously, if there was ever another issue, we would have to pull this crankshaft and just replace it, or replace that left side web anyhow. And this thing had been sitting, I guess, for a little while, so the brake pads are dragging just a little bit. I just went ahead and rubbed them on some sandpaper and got those smoothed back out. And I think the bearings were not adjusted properly for the steering stem, so went ahead and re-greased them and retorqued all that stuff back down. Got the flywheel back on with some red thread locker. Snug that up real good. Went ahead and drained the fuel, put in some fresh non-ethanol with some Caster 927 at 32 to 1, and she fired right off. Now, I guess I was having some issues. I don't remember. I've done so many of these. They all seem to need carburetor work when they've been sitting, so pulled them out, checked and cleaned the jets, and retuned the carburetor. Check the float level. That's it. This bike actually ripped. This was a supplemental video that I did, and I believe this was the KX250F. I believe that's the one. And what we're doing is heating the head to expand it a little bit and replacing the valve guides due to one being broken. So this is basically just giving you a step-by-step on how to replace these valve guides in this. And of course, you can't just put valve guides in and expect it to work. They need to be reamed to the proper size for your valve and then honed the rest of the way. You can see the valves move nice and freely now. And then after that, I just test to make sure that they're sealing properly with some brake clean. 2008 RMZ250. This bike, if I remember right, was sitting outside without the cylinder and head on it for a while. It was kind of a mess. So everything looked great in the bottom end, but when I pulled it apart, I decided to pull it apart because it looked like it had some leaves or something in there, and I'm glad I did because it was an absolute mess in there. Replaced all the seals, cleaned everything up like new. Went ahead and replaced the valve seals and put it all back together. Here we're testing to make sure that the oil pump is pumping oil up to the head. Went ahead and replace the front tire. Obviously, go through it, replace the carburetor and mid-body gaskets. New chain, new sprockets, new seat cover. And this bike was awesome. This thing had a ton of power and ran absolutely beautiful. Turned out to be a gorgeous bike. 2004 Honda CRF250. This was a weird setup on this one. So the exhaust rocker, for some reason, I'm assuming that the roller locked up and it just wore a enormous divot in the rocker, and it damaged the camshaft as well. So I ended up on this one here getting an entire used cylinder head. That came with everything, and that was a little bit costly, but the whole bottom end was in really good shape. We were just checking to make sure that it was pumping oil, and all I basically had to do was bolt that on, yeah, shim the valves, and she was good to go. Same thing, it's been sitting. Go ahead and go through the carburetor, replace the mid-body gaskets. Chain lubing. Rebuild on the rear caliper. Must have been sticking or something, or super dirty. New air filter as we always do. And this bike is another one in the books. So one of my customers had given me this jet ski, and it had been sitting for quite a while, and she said, it's probably going to need some new gas and a battery. And went ahead and cleaned it up real good, and it was actually in really pretty decent shape. The decompression was fantastic on it. I think we were getting like 125 per cylinder, which is not perfect, but very good. We went ahead and drained the fuel out, threw that in the old Tundra. It did have a little bit of water in the bottom of it. You can see the separation between the water and the fuel. Got myself a new battery. And after I remembered to turn the gas on, she started right up. So we took her out and test rode her, and this thing would just continue to keep shutting off on me, shutting off. And it also didn't want to accelerate. So back to the drawing board here. Got it back and found out that both of the, and it's something I probably should have checked, but both of the hoses from the oil pump to the rotary valve, which puts the two-stroke oil into the engine, were not even on there. So this thing wasn't even getting any lubrication. I have no idea how I didn't blow it up, but readjusted the pump, got all that running properly. And the acceleration issue turned out to be typical Seadoo issues, which is the sleeve. Went ahead and replaced the sleeve, cleaned up that pump real well, replaced the bearing and seal. And the impeller on it was actually in really good shape as well. The last time taking it out, one of the bunks broke. So off to the old trusty box store. And the way I like to do these is use the pressure treated 2x4s, then put some of this PVC board on top of it. It's super slick. Just countersink the stainless steel screws into it and wedge the end, and I'll reinstall these, and it really helps the ski or the boat to slide. I'll have to do this with my boat. But took it out and ran it for 15-20 minutes. No shut off, nice acceleration. Ski ran beautiful. That's a win. So my customer who gave me the free ski was due to working on these two skis that she had, and neither of them worked. I got one of them running and pulled this one apart and told her there's water ingestion. There was sand in this engine, all kinds of stuff. So she basically gave me this ski for free for working on the other ski. So basically I decided to pull this one down to see if there was anything usable about it, and the rotary valve had a huge ding in it, which had gone around and scored both of the cases. I'm not sure if that's even fixable, but so the drive shaft for the rotary valve, also that gear had been stripped out, probably because that piece got stuck there. So I ended up getting a used motor, supposedly rebuilt. Looked like it was in pretty good shape and was pulling like 145 psi compression. Went ahead and pulled the oil tank out, cleaned all that out of there, because these things are just not, you got to make sure you clean, you can't mix oils. You got to make sure you clean all that stuff out. So I pressure checked the oil system to make sure that the crankshaft was in good shape and that center seal held fine. This water jacket was broken on both of the skis, unfortunately. I panel bonded one, or JB welded one in, and the other one I used a brass fitting, which I thought was going to be a little bit more secure, and that's the one I ended up putting on. However, I could not get this cooling system in the engine to seal up, and it just was where that cover goes in, there was just like way too much corrosion in there. So pulled that back apart, and a small little wire wheel on the Dremel took care of that problem, and we were holding 3 psi. You drop the engine back in, get everything hooked back up again. I replaced all the hoses down to the pump. Went ahead and bled the pump out, and went ahead and set the pump timing up. Obviously, we drained the fuel, put some non-ethanol in there. This thing ran absolutely beautiful on the stand, would rev up, idle all day long. So we cleaned her up, get ready to take her out and lake test her. Well, that's where everything kind of has gone wrong with it. It just will not start in the water. Even if you start it out of the water and back it in, it shuts right off. It's trying, but it just won't start. So I still haven't fixed this ski to this point. This here is a customer's KFX450R, really kind of a goofy setup here. It's a no start. So in other words, just click, click, click when you press the button. You know, this guy's pretty smart, and obviously a lot of times when you get that clicking, it just means you got a bad battery. And first I found like kind of a loose connection on the battery and thought, hey, that's the problem. But testing it out further, every time I would press the button, I would only be getting 7 volts, and she would click. So I went through the system, even jumped out the solenoid, and you can see this thing sparking like crazy. So that's a dead short. And as soon as I pulled the feed wire from the solenoid to the starter, I got 12 volts there, no problem. And I knew I had a short in that starter. And right away you can see that there is no isolating washer between where the power goes in and ground, which is the case with the starter. So I pulled the starter all apart just to make sure there was nothing internal that was damaged. Went ahead and made an isolating washer. We put that back together, and the starter spun up beautifully. Thumbs up. So we put the starter back in, and press the button, engine doesn't want to turn. And once I pull the side cover off, it's clear that the one-way clutch, the starter sprag clutch, was just no good. Unfortunately on this, I don't know if somebody tried to pull the flywheel off at one point, but all the threads were stripped on it, and I could not get my puller on it. And I'm telling you, I worked forever on this thing, heating and beating, and it just would not pop loose. So what I ended up having to do was go in there and actually cut the entire flywheel off and notch it to the point where it would finally pop off with the chisel gun. So a customer brought me a new flywheel and a new sprag bearing. Put that together, and she spun right up. Beautiful. We checked it to make sure she was pumping oil. I went ahead and re-shimmed the valves on this one because they were a little bit tight. And it ran. It didn't want to idle that great. This thing was super loud with the exhaust. And I gave it back to him, and it turned out that it was an issue with the CDI as well. So he went ahead and put a used CDI in it, and as far as I know, it was good to go from there. Next one was a 99 RM125. You guessed it. We need to go ahead and rebuild this crankshaft. I like using the Pro X. They seem to work pretty good for these, and I've not had an issue with them. Using that shop-made tool, that's coming in handy pretty good over here. Put some new main bearings and seals. After we trued our crankshaft, we throw it back in. I don't remember if I even re-ring this thing or not. I don't know. I usually try to do that, so I probably did. Look at the sludge coming out of this thing. Clean the carburetor, reset the float. And suck out all the crappy brake fluid out of this nasty master cylinder. Clean that up real good. Bled the brakes, and she started and ran pretty good. Now this had a cracked rear rim, and it had quite a wobble on it. It looked like some spokes were damaged too, so I just went ahead and cut all the spokes off, got a new rear hoop, laced that up. And we went ahead and trued the wheel up. And then I cheaped out and just put the old tire back on. So we put a new clutch because this thing was grabbing. And then I took this thing for a test ride, and it had no power band. So I pulled it back apart and found out that that bearing was missing off the governor. And this thing would never actuate the power valve. So easy fix. Next, I picked up this 2007 YZ450F, and this thing was in pieces in the box. And I probably could have built this bike. I ended up parting it out. There was just way too many parts that were incorrect for the bike. So the head was correct. The piston looked correct, and it was brand new. But unfortunately, the piston was for a YFZ450, which is different. And the cylinder was also from a YFZ. And we're just leak testing this cylinder head to see if we had to get in there and do any kind of work to those seats. And you can see the wrist pin obviously doesn't fit. So, and when I went ahead and drained the oil/water out of the engine, I just decided to go ahead and let somebody else use this bike for parts, or let somebody else use the parts off of this. I wasn't going to build it. So I picked up this totally beat to death 2019 KX85. Crankshaft felt pretty good, but he said, it's making a noise in the bottom end. Didn't really want to get involved with that. And we went ahead and pulled the engine, split the cases, and it turns out both of the main bearings were absolutely trashed on this thing. In fact, they fell right out of the case. And I had to cut and chisel the bearing off of the crankshaft. The crankshaft itself was true and no issues there. So we replaced the main bearings, new seals, cleaned the cases up real good, and put this thing back together. Now, this thing had been dropped at one time on the exhaust pipe, and it had broken the retaining port for the exhaust. So I tried my hand at doing some JB Weld repair on this. As like I said, I do not have a AC TIG welder as of yet. This needed to be TIG welded. Unfortunately, this repair did not last. And before I sold the bike, it broke. So I told the customer about it, or the buyer about it, and he said no problem. I gave him a break on it, and I think he went ahead and replaced the cylinder. But this bike ran fantastic. It really pulled pretty hard. I put new grips on it, new levers, new tires front and rear, all new plastics, and new graphics. Chain and sprockets. This bike came out gorgeous. (2001) YZ125. And this bike had supposedly been sitting for a good long time. I poured some fuel down in the cylinder while I was purchasing it, and it did start up. Took that yellow side case off, cleaned that up, repainted it, pulled the exhaust off, and hit that with some high heat paint. While I was in there, obviously the clutch is loose as anything, and it was missing washers. So went ahead and replaced all that stuff. Went ahead and put a new rear tire and tube, and the kick start shaft was cracked, so went ahead and replaced that as well. Went ahead and replaced the front wheel bearings. This nut that was on the steering shaft was stripped out completely. I had another set of clamps, so I just went and put them on, resealed the forks while they were apart. Just like anything else, go through the carburetor. Obviously, you can see there's a lot of green corrosion in there. That's generally from using ethanol fuel. And then the suspension was super tight. I could jump up and down on it and it wouldn't move. And it turned out that this linkage bearing was totally frozen up, and I had another swing arm around, so I pulled the linkage bearing off, linkage off of that, and that smoothed it right out. Throw some non-ethanol, 32-1. Great. Bike ran beautiful. A lot of power. So obviously I went ahead and put some new plastics on it. And she's ready to be back out on the track again. So the 2014 Kawasaki KX250F, which is my final project of this year. Man, I almost parted this one out. I bought this one at the same time as I bought that YZ125, and it had a hole in the cases, broken crankshaft. He gave me another set of cases which had a little bit of damage to them, but I ended up deciding to rebuild this bike, and I'm glad I did because it came out absolutely gorgeous. He had a lot of extra parts for it, like a new crankshaft. It was missing the clutch completely, so I had to go on the old interwebs and pick that up. He had a new cylinder and piston for it. And a lot of this is the reason why I decided to go ahead and build it, because he did have a lot of the parts for it. The head was done professionally and looked like brand new, which is fantastic. And that was just a bolt on, and check my valve clearances, and that was simple. Put some oil in and check this thing to make sure that she's pumping oil properly before we go too far, and that was perfect. So non-ethanol fuel, E-free if you will. Fired right up. But there was no mid-pipe, no exhaust, so it was pretty loud. Went ahead and pulled the rear wheel off and replaced the sprocket. And then I did some diagnostics because I did have a trouble code. It turns out it was just corrosion on the throttle position sensor. Super easy fix. I got lucky on that one. The bike was sitting outside for a while and got that problem taken care of. We threw some new grips and some new levers. I went ahead and put all new plastics on it. Typical stripped or stuck bolt for the shroud retaining bolts there. So we had to do a little bit of heating to get that done. Went ahead and took off the old stickers and got a new graphics kit for it, which I absolutely love. I'm a big fan of stock looking graphics. We used some SC1 to polish everything out. And this bike is just absolutely stunning, absolutely beautiful, and runs fantastic. 1999 Suzuki RM125. I was kind of doing this at the same time as the KX250F, which was the final project of the year. This one did start but same issue as usual. We need to replace the crankshaft connecting rod. As you can see on this one, it was missing that bearing as well for the power valve actuator and the governor. So another Pro X connecting rod, back in business. Intrude her out. She's gorgeous. A little bit of heat on the cases. Get ourselves a new set of main bearings and crankshaft seals. In fact, seals for the entire engine, including the water pump, which is inside the cases on the 98, 99, and 2000. Very strange. And check the cylinder to make sure that's in good shape. And I ended up going with a Namura piston. Quick hone on the cylinder. And I got called out a lot on this thing. And I think I might have made a little bit of a mistake. They said that I probably should have drilled out for the exhaust bridge a couple of holes for oiling. And I just did not do that. I didn't notice it. And the bike's still running fine, but I probably should have done that. And thank you guys for pointing that out to me. Obviously, we're going to go through the carburetor on any of these bikes that have been sitting. Beautiful. Starts right up. Runs fantastic. So if anybody's ever run into this before, which I'm sure you have if you work on these, the old sticky camshaft. Camshafts do not want to turn, and that's almost always due to over tightening them cam caps or a lack of lubrication, which has damaged the head or the cam caps. But if the head and cam cap is not damaged and it is just from over tightening, there is a way to fix it. And in this video, I just kind of go over the routine that I use. Now, I do tell you that it's not the way to 100% fix this. I mean, obviously, the way to fix this properly would be to replace the head. The caps are only sold with the head because they're line bored from the factory to the proper specifications. However, they're expensive, and this does work. I've done it many, many times, and if you're careful and take your time, you can get all your clearances back to where they need to be and get some more life out of this. And after all was said and done, and everything was torqued down, everything was spinning absolutely free like it's supposed to. And on this one here, it was basically just the intake cam that was holding up, but she's good now. This was a 2003 Yamaha TTR125E electric start. Um, the E model, not the L model, and it was locked up. There was some sludge in there, and we had a lot of rust in the cylinder, so we had to pull the top end apart on this. And the guy got this off of his great guy, and this used to be his wife's bike, so it sat for very many years, and unfortunately she's not able to ride it anymore. So we hit this cylinder with a little bit of penetrating oil. He used the old magic claw that you guys love, and she was able to pop right apart. I ended up having another used cylinder and piston that were in excellent condition that I just cleaned up and resurfaced and cleaned up the combustion chamber on the cylinder head itself and tested that for any kind of leaks, and that held fine. So there was no issues with the valve seats or anything like that. Sent the head out for resurfacing as well. Went ahead and adjusted our valve clearances, which are super simple on these. I wish they would do that on the race bikes as well. And the carburetor was just basically a pond of sludge, so that's going in the trash. Rehone the cylinder to get our crosshatch pattern back, and bolt everything back together. These are kind of tricky to get in and out. Bolts are really long, and there's just not a lot of clearance, but it is doable. So we reset our timing marks, check for spark, which we couldn't do before, and that was great. I did have an old carburetor as well, so I cleaned that one up, put a new petcock on it, a new battery. We checked the starting system. The electric start worked great. Went ahead and did the maintenance items, like an air filter and to change the oil. E3. Boom, she fired right up. Of course, she's smoking a little bit from all the build oil. And then I just threw on a couple more little accoutrements, fixed the rear brake pedal, which was bent, and tried this new tool that I got for plastic welding, and that actually worked pretty good. Instead of Frankensteining them with zip ties, did some adjustments on the bars, new grips, new levers. Gave her a nice pressure wash. Hit her up with the old SC1. We took this thing for a ride, and it ran great. So this one ended up under some kid's Christmas tree. Also had a couple of sponsors from Viva, which was great with some of their tools. So check them out with my affiliate link. Now this is a customer's bike as well, 2004 Yamaha YZ250. Said it would not start, had a weak spark. This is my same customer with my KFX450. Well, he had some damage from a fall and took it apart, and it ended up being, I think, on this, there's a couple of things. Had great compression, but it looked like the flywheel. I mean, I was able to just pull it off with my hands without using a puller, and I don't think he torqued that down properly. I also cleaned the connection for the stator plug and checked the stator for all of its resistances, and all of that stuff was great. I torqued the flywheel down properly and ended up getting a fantastic spark, and this thing fired right off, no problem. A lot of power in this bike. I wish I could have bought it off of them. But again, I ended up finishing up the KX250F, and that was the end of my year. So that's going to do it for this video.